Hey everyone, it's Sevi. After only 3 patches, my husband is coming out of his reading corner to once again give players an opportunity to view his beautiful backside. Some may be surprised that Alhaitham's first rerun came this quickly after his initial release, but after a similar thing happened with Sino, who can say anymore what's going through Hoyo's head? Anyway, with Alhaitham being a relatively new unit, I think it's a great opportunity to talk about what we've learned about him since his release, his teammate roster, some concerns about him, quick build advice, and his overall pull value. If you aren't all that familiar yet with Alhaitham and how he works, I highly advise you to check out my guide on him, which I'll link below. With all that said, let's get into it. First, let's talk about Alhaitham's general power level. Despite my being a self-proclaimed Alhaitham simp-turned-wife, I can objectively say that he is a strong on-field DPS with very strong teams. Much of Alhaitham's power comes from the fact that he is a Dendro unit that can apply a lot of Dendro at quite frequent intervals via his projection attacks and Dendro-infused auto attacks. His projection attacks proc every 1.6 seconds, and in addition to that, if you didn't know, his projection attack ICD is once every 2 hits, which means that half his projection attacks apply Dendro. As a result, he can output high personal damage via frequent spread reactions, complementing already good multipliers. And these spread mirror procs are what will mainly pull out big numbers from the big man. He can also be a good driver / enabler for bloom related reactions, especially for hyper bloom and quick bloom teams, which have proven to be consistently strong meta comps. So because he can enable or use these reactions so well, Alhaitham has a high damage floor and feels very strong even at C0 and on a free-to-play weapon. His projection attacks are also AoE, so Alhaitham teams can actually perform well in both single and multi-target scenarios. Now, does this power level come with a cost? Or perhaps a learning curve? Well, kind of. First of all, Alhaitham's main limitation is that he is an on-field unit with 0 off-field presence. As in, if he's not on field, he's literally doing nothing. Almost as if he's that feeble scholar who makes himself completely inaccessible when his work hours are over. That being said, maximizing Alhaitham's damage means maximizing how he spends his on-field duration to maintain as much mirror uptime as possible. And this was one concern when he first came out, that his rotations may be too restrictive or rigid or just complicated for the general player. It's certainly true that it takes some level of engagement to play Alhaitham well, because you will also want to start considering the timings of his mirror refresh, mixing in his skill and charged attack and so on. So it will take a bit more practice than the average DPS, but if you are up to the task, I can confidently say it can feel very rewarding. So how do his rotations generally go, and are they really that strict? Let's do a quick review of them. First is what I like to call his standard rotation. You open with his burst, spawn 3 mirrors, and refresh those mirrors after every 2 projection attacks to get a total of 6 3 mirror procs. There's also a trick where you can use the 2 seconds between his burst and mirror generation to swap to another unit first and swap back. But that's completely optional and not something I would advise doing if you're on high ping or in a situation where you might get staggered easily. One downside to this rotation though is that it can get quite energy hungry, because if his burst isn't full again by the time it's off cooldown, you might feel at a loss at how to start the next rotation, and he only generates particles for himself when he's doing mirror procs. For such cases, he has alternatives. The next best way to get all 3 mirrors at once is to hold his skill even if it's pointed to the ground, then auto attack to plunge, proccing his passive. As long as his plunge hits an enemy, he will get his 3 mirror proc right away. He won't be able to refresh his mirrors immediately after though, since his skill and passive are still on cooldown, so you'll want to swap off him after his mirrors proc twice. After swapping off, you can rotate through his teammates to refresh their abilities or generate more energy for them via skills. Then swap back to him, do his burst to generate all his mirrors, wait for his projection attacks to proc twice, and refresh with his charged attack for 2 more projection attacks. Then rotate teammates' abilities again before returning to his skill plunge. This kind of 2-part rotation is more forgiving with his energy needs and is something you can adapt depending on the situation, if he needs more or less field time or needs to swap off prematurely. If you're playing him with Yae, who uses 12 to 15 second rotations, you'll want to adapt Alhaitham's rotation this way. There are still some things to watch out for though, like Alhaitham getting interrupted. Alhaitham's projection attacks only happen when he's hitting the enemy with auto attacks, so if he's staggered and misses some hits, he might also miss some projection attacks. Still, his combos have enough allowance to let him dash in between, providing him iframes. This issue can also be mitigated by teammates, which I'll get to soon. I personally don't have too much trouble with it, but it definitely sucks when it happens. So to wrap up this section, I just want to emphasize that Alhaitham's best damage output does come with certain rotations that do desire some skill and attention, but they still have some flexibility and can be adapted according to the situation. And most of all, learning them makes Alhaitham instantly like you. The next thing I want to cover is Alhaitham's #1 teammate, Kaveh.
Huh?
I'm kidding, it's Nahida.
Oh,
It's no secret that damage-wise, Nahida is Alhaitham's #1 support. In general, giving Alhaitham a Dendro teammate is beneficial. At the minimum, they can hold 4-piece Deepwood, allowing Alhaitham to use artifact sets with higher DPS potential, and they can generate Dendro particles that will help Alhaitham's energy needs and rotations. Nahida can do both those functions to a stellar degree and more. In addition, her burst gives Alhaitham EM, which he likes a lot of, on top of contributing a good portion of damage herself. Still, it's important to note that Alhaitham can perform well without Nahida on his team, especially if you want Nahida on your other Spiral Abyss team. Alhaitham can function as a solo Dendro or use basically any other off-field Dendro. Half the time, I actually use Alhaitham with Yao Yao, who was released alongside him and is on his rerun banner too. There's also Baiju or Kirara if you have them, and as a last resort, the free options Dendro Traveler and Kole are nonetheless serviceable. Without Nahida, he will still have good personal damage, apply a lot of on-field Dendro, and can drive his teammates. So if you want Alhaitham but don't yet have Nahida, you can still feel confident in his performance as a DPS. The other angle to this is that if you already have Nahida, Alhaitham might slightly feel redundant, because Nahida can also drive as an on-fielder, apply a lot of Dendro, output good damage too, plus buff her teammates and have great off-field presence, which Alhaitham doesn't have. And if you are on a budget but are very decided on saving for Nahida, then you might really want to consider what units can be more flexible and horizontal value adding for your account, if that matters to you. Of course, if you really just want a very attractive man to stare at as he wields not 1, but 2 swords, then I'm definitely not going to deter you, because hey, that's pretty much what I wanted too. But if you already have Nahida and maybe are saving for another character, then you can be assured that most of Alhaitham's teams can be achieved through Nahida anyway. Outside of Nahida, Alhaitham actually has a good selection of teammates as of now, and very likely in the future. He mainly looks for off-field units that also make great use of the Dendro reactions he enables and can produce multiple sources of damage for the team. His most popular teams are Quicken and Quick Bloom, as they really allow Alhaitham to spread his wings. For these teams, you're mainly looking at his Electro options for Quicken teams and Hydro for Bloom-related teams. Among Electro, Kuki is a great pick, especially for Quicken Hyper Bloom teams where she is both a Quicken enabler and a Hyper Bloom trigger, not to mention a healer. There's also Beidou, who Alhaitham can easily drive with his normal attacks, and he can also benefit from her damage reduction and interruption resistance. Yeah, you can perform great with him, and even Raiden can be an off-field Hyper Bloom trigger. Fischl is also a good choice, especially in single target, but as a solo Electro, she won't be able to contribute as much damage compared to being in aggravate-centric teams due to how her A4 passive works. Among Hydros, Xingqiu and Yelan are very strong choices. They both have their unique advantages, but you can't go wrong with either of them. The other off-field Hydro units are viable too, but don't synergize as well as Xingqiu or Yelan do. So I am hoping that once we get to Fontaine and meet new Hydro characters, some of them will become popular teammates for Alhaitham as well. You also want to take note of defensive units for Alhaitham. Healers can generally be enough, but as I mentioned earlier, depending on your player skill, you may benefit from some kind of interruption resistance, especially in these unholy days of the consecrated beasts. Whether it's a shielder like Kirara or Zhongli, or a pseudo-shielder like Baiju, or Beidou or Xingqiu who provide interruption resistance, they can help you more comfortably execute his combos. Aside from his Quicken and Quick Bloom formats, remember that he can function just as a driver too, and in some cases he won't be doing a lot of spread or reaction damage. An obvious example is in Nilou Bloom, where there's no Electro units to proc Quicken, and Dendro is ideally the aura instead of a trigger. Alhaitham may also be in a Hyper Bloom team that doesn't give much Quicken uptime at all, such as with both Xingqiu and Yelan, or he can be a Burgeon driver too. Determining whether Alhaitham is doing spread damage or simply driving without proccing reactions also determines his best build, which we'll cover next. Not much has changed in Alhaitham's weapon since his first run, since no new contenders have been released, but Alhaitham generally has a good amount of flexibility when it comes to building him. He primarily chooses among weapons with crit, EM, and in some circumstances, ER substats. And these various options range from free-to-play, gacha, and 5 stars, so use what's most accessible to you. His artifact farming can be quite convenient too. First, note that if he's the only Dendro on the team, he would by default be holding a Deepwood set. So assuming someone else is using Deepwood, using 2-piece combos comes very close to using a full Gilded Dream set, and the combos can even pull ahead with better substats. We're mainly looking at 2-piece sets of EM, ER, Deepwood, and as a lower priority attack. So you can pretty much focus your resin on the Gilded Deepwood domain, strongbox or passively farm Wanderer's True pieces from bosses, and if you have spare emblem or attack bonus pieces, those can work too. So there's no need to get hung up on completing a full set for Alhaitham, and just focus on getting the right main stats and substats. His stat priorities haven't changed since my first guide on him, but ER is something to pay attention to in particular. Ideally, to maximize his personal damage, Alhaitham has a good enough energy situation that he only needs ER from substats. If he's trying to do the standard combo where he opens with his burst every time, this usually involves a Dendro teammate and or Favonius equipment on the team so that he only needs about 140% ER or so. However, this doesn't have to be a strict rule. I said in my initial guide that using rotations with lower ER requirements would be a DPS loss, but I want to update that with the alternative 2-part skill plunge rotation I highlighted earlier. This rotation significantly lowers his and potentially his teammates' ER requirements, allows you to build more offensive stats, and as long as you don't overly extend his field time, his DPS will still even out. Now let's say you want to spoil the Feeble Scholar, even if you should be spoiling his broker mate instead, and you're looking to vertically invest in Alhaitham. What should you prioritize? First, it's important to establish that Alhaitham is an unusual 5-star, where his constellations don't actually add a lot of DPS increase until you get to his C6. This is a huge contrast compared to most other 5-star constellations. He balances this out though by being entirely complete at C0 and by being among the highest performing DPSs at C0. So when it comes to his constellations and signature weapon, also known as the Lo-Fi, I would actually say it's better to prioritize his weapon. If your starting point is a C0 Alhaitham on a free-to-play EM weapon, upgrading to his signature weapon is almost equivalent to getting his C3 in terms of DPS increase. However, it's also important to point out that other 5-star crit weapons like Jade Cutter, Mist-Splitter, and Haran are closer competitors to the Lo-Fi, so if you already have one of those, then pulling Lo-Fi isn't going to be as big a bump in damage. But another way you can vertically invest in Alhaitham is actually by investing in his teammate Nahida. If you don't have her yet, pulling her to strengthen your Alhaitham team is something you can aim for among the other many benefits of having the Dendro Archon on your account. And if you're really dedicated to the guy, then you can aim for Nahida C2, and at least other characters can benefit from that too. So finally, what do I think of Alhaitham's pull value? Alhaitham is like very thick icing on the large Dendro cake. While you can make great cohesive teams with other Dendro units, Alhaitham is pretty much the premier on-field Dendro DPS. If you're looking for an upgrade in that role or regard, he's a very worthy pull. And if you still want to fill up your own DPS roster, he is among the highest performing C0 units in that category and a great choice to throw your primos at. But in the same way, if you've already invested in other DPSs or don't want to invest any more in the Dendro meta, then Alhaitham's pull value becomes a lot lower. Another factor to consider is that Alhaitham is currently running alongside Kazaha, a premier Animo support that can do a lot of his functions from off-field. Kazaha can slot into teams you've maybe already built and simply make them better. Kazaha will also very likely complement more on-field and off-field units that will be released in the future. In many cases, between pulling Alhaitham or Kazaha, Kazaha will be a more flexible and future-proof choice for accounts that still have neither. And with Fontaine on the horizon, it might also be time to start saving up for new releases, especially the Hydro Archon. Of course, I can't know exactly at this point what new characters will meet in the coming versions. But what I do know is that despite Alhaitham being classified as a somewhat luxurious luxury pull, he is a top tier DPS that won't disappoint if you do pull him. He and his teams are very strong now, especially with Dendro being at the top of the meta. It's difficult to imagine Hoyo releasing another 5-star on-field DPS that can perform better than him in the same role. So if you're still on the fence about him, I would say simply see if you like his playstyle. Check out his character trial, see if the rhythm of his gameplay is something you can get used to. If it is, and you decide it's a good time to spend your primos, then know that you're getting one of the best C0 DPSs with accessible builds, teams, and stylish animations to fill your screen as the enemies suffer his process of elimination. And besides, if you do end up benching him for another on-field DPS, then at least you'll always have his 12-pack abs in your character inventory to cheer you up whenever you feel sad. And that's going to be all for this Alhaitham video. Let me know in the comments what you think of Alhaitham, whether you're an Alhaitham haver, or wanter, or simp, or roommate in disguise. I would love to know. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all soon. Take care!